Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Fire These Times. My name is Ayman Makarem, and I'll be your host for today. I'm joined by two guests, Malek Rasamny and Matt Peterson, to talk about their 10-year-long multimedia project called The Native and the Refugee. The project, in a nutshell, is a juxtaposition of indigenous communities in the Americas with Palestinian communities in the Middle East. And over the last 10 years, it has taken many forms. It has brought new conversations to new communities, and is all in all just a very interesting project that I think is more relevant now than ever, especially as the framework of settler colonialism becomes more and more apparent. We talk about their project, we talk about the framework of settler colonialism, we obviously talk about the current genocide that is taking place in Gaza, and the implications and the sort of movements and solidarity in trying to stop this current genocide, and how they've seen these discourses change over the 10 years that they've worked on this project together. So, before jumping into this episode, I've got a few announcements. The Fire These Times is, of course, expanding and includes now several podcasts, and with that expansion, we need your help. So if you'd like to support this podcast, if you appreciate it, there are many ways you can do so. The main way is to become a member of our Patreon, which not only supports us financially for as little as $5 a month, but also gives you access to a lot of exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout so you can meet members of our team, and early releases, etc., etc. There are a lot of perks, and we'd love to have you. Otherwise, if you're not able to support us financially, consider leaving this podcast a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps boost us in the algorithm so that we can get seen and more people know about this podcast, etc., etc. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoyed this episode.
It's really great to be on The Fire These Times here with you, Ayman. My name is Malek Rasamny. I'm a filmmaker, also a writer to some degree. And me and Matt, in 2014, we started a multimedia research project together called The Native and the Refugee, which has consisted of short videos, presentations, workshops, a book that came out last year called The Mohawk Warrior Society, and of course a feature film called Spaces of Exception, which is currently having a world tour. The essence of the project has really been framed around a juxtaposing really Palestinian refugee camps in the Middle East and native reservations in the United States. And that is the subject of the film Spaces of Exception, which kind of profiles several reservations in the US and 4 different Palestinian refugee camps, 2 in Lebanon and 2 in the West Bank. It's good to be here, Ayman, because I remember we met each other at the world premiere of the film back in 2019 at the Sharjah Film Platform. So it's nice to be here years later talking about the work on this podcast. It's great.
Yeah, I'll definitely talk about Sharjah in a minute. But first, Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Matt Peterson. I'm based in New York. And yeah, we started the project, like Malek was saying, back in 2014. And, it's been interesting to see since then the different waves of interest in both, native struggles and resistance here in the US, but also Palestinian movements and struggles in the Middle East, and how those things become in and out of focus and visibility globally. And I think, the last 6 months, I think, as of recording yesterday, I think was the 6-month anniversary of October 7th. So the last 6 months, there's obviously been an immense amount of interest and support in many ways for Palestine, which has meant in a lot of people digging deeper into the history of how we got to this, current dynamic within Gaza. But also thinking more broadly about settler colonialism and different, histories and places where that's happened. So, for us, it's brought a lot more interest into our project and into specifically the feature film Space of Exception. We've been showing it all over the world, and we've been invited to speak about it in different kinds of contexts, universities, community centers, art spaces, etc. And it's interesting to think about and see how the work, we started 10 years ago relates to the current moment, and how even for us, we kind of learn new things about the films that we made, and the relevance and the meaning, and how to find ways to understand what's happening. Gaza is under siege. There, in a lot of ways, there's not much people feel like they can do to enter into that blockade, and I think information and news and history and analysis and research is one of the forms of solidarity that can happen, outside of that siege, outside of that blockade or something. And then thinking about, what is the future vision for these, colonial projects and their sort of undoing. So anyway, all of that, some of the things that, we've been talking and thinking about, and ourselves learning about the last 6 months from our project. So yeah, grateful to be on the podcast and think with you guys more about that.
Yeah, no, thank you both for joining. Definitely, I find it very interesting that, yeah, it's been 5 years since we both screened our films. I had a film called El Hamad, which was a satire at
Great
Sharjah.
film.
Thank you. Um, but wow, so if it's been since 2014, that's a 10-year long project. And one thing that I think was really interesting is that it's hard to recognize now how new or relatively new the framework understanding of Palestine as or of Zionism as a form of settler colonialism. Because I think growing up there wasn't that much of that out there, and now there definitely it does seem to be slightly more into the mainstream. And so, how have you seen that shift over the last 10 years through your project? And that's definitely like a very specific angle and a really important one to in the juxtaposition of the experience and the dispossession of indigenous peoples in the Americas and of Palestinians, and as well as in Australia and New Zealand and in other contexts. If you want to talk a bit more about sort of that angle of settler colonialism, that perspective. So would either of you like to take that or
Yeah, I no, 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 that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think what with the Palestinian conflict, Palestinian, it's part of its history is that how it's looked or how it's been understood has morphed and changed over time. I mean, even going back to the very beginning, it was kind of understood as an Arab-Israeli conflict, and then after 67, it became a kind of Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and then different words that pop. Like when we were young, I think growing up in the 90s, the kind of framework was occupation, understanding, because it seemed at that time like the primary issue was this occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And then I think after Jimmy Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, the idea of apartheid kind of it had existed before, but became kind of, let's say, popular. I think partially after that book, apartheid became a major framework for understanding it. Now the term genocide is coming into play as a way of understanding what's going on in Gaza. But I think if you want to make sense of the broad history, there's this question of temporality, right? In the case of so one of the main critiques of the film has been, okay, that the Palestinian and Israeli conflict are quite different, or they feel quite different. And that's because to people, this is not true, but they don't feel contemporary in the same way, right? It feels like, and that's because not that the Native, first of all, one of our interventions as a side note was to show that Native American struggles are very contemporary, A. But B, even an understanding that it is true that there is this kind of long breadth of history in terms of understanding the colonization of the Americas over the past 400 years. But when one looks at that, because we have this kind of the vantage point of history and the benefit of history, we can see that what unites all of the different treaties, broken treaties, wars, epidemics, attempts at assimilation versus attempts at extermination. What's united all these disparate kind of moments and these disparate kind of phases has been an overriding dynamic of settler colonialism. And I think now, as the Palestinian is as Zionism is is over a century old, and as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, at least mapping since the Nakba, is now almost I guess 70 years old. I think and seeing now that we're entering in many ways a new kind of phase since October 7th, a new phase of the conflict, or a new phase of the occupation, or a new phase of settler colonialism, I would say, I think settler colonialism does become a useful map in order to understand all of the different, to create an overwhelming, an overriding logic that can help us understand 67, 48, 2023, Oslo Accords, etc., siege. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times when we use terms like apartheid, people start getting into the, okay, this is not technically apartheid, or it's, that's because apartheid as a term really comes out of what we understand from South Africa, just like our ideas of genocide are intimately linked to the Holocaust. But I think for a framework in terms of trying to understand what's going on with Palestine, I think, yeah, I think settler colonialism is a very important, or maybe a key framework that can really unite everything. That's one. Number two, linked to the idea of settler colonialism is also the idea of Palestinians as indigenous people. And I think that's also something that's becoming clearer and clearer now, because there was a time where, okay, do we understand Palestinians as being Arabs, as being part of an Arab resistance to Zionism? Is it, are the Palestinians a competing nation that is in competition or in conflict with the state of Israel? What exactly is the root of Palestinian resistance to or reaction against the Zionist project? And I think there are many different lenses, but I do think the key lens is the lens of indigeneity, in the sense that Palestinians view themselves as, and indeed are, the indigenous people of the land. And they're indigenous precisely because they're facing settler colonialism. I mean, settler colonialism creates indigeneity. And I think that's more than any kind of nationalism or Arabism or question of religion. Certainly, that's the kind of bedrock of trying to understand all the phases of Palestinian resistance to the settler colonial project of Zionism. So, and I think this is becoming more and more clear now. And there's also, of course, way more solidarity between native people and Palestinians. And that's been one of the more heartening things to see, that has been growing, I think, since we started the project, to see more and more of those explicit, on an activist level, more and more of those explicit ties or connections being made.
Yeah, I think the last 6 months have been interesting, or the last 10 years of the project, because as Malek's saying, there are these different historical shifts about, in some ways they're semantic debates, but then they become kind of conceptual debates to think about how we understand history, how we understand politics, how these things are narrated or something. Malek was just talking, genocide being the one, most recently, the 6 months, the kind of particular semantic debates about what qualifies as a genocide and why and how that's determined or something. In some ways, it's quite bizarre that there would need to be such, minute debates about it, when what we're seeing is so horrific, and then still having to think through whether this particular word applies to this particular moment. It's kind of apocalyptic in a way when you take a step back and think about that. We would have to think about that. But then, there's also been, in the Atlantic and other, popular American publications, debates about settler colonialism itself, whether, one, it exists at all. There were some think pieces saying, oh, this is just made up on college campuses and it's not a real thing. But even if it is a real thing, it doesn't apply to Israel, or it doesn't apply to the United States, and thinking about these sort of mental gymnastics that have been going on the last 6 months to contest these terms. And then, in the context of our project, even thinking about refugeehood itself, because part of the right of return is, supposedly, recognized by the United Nations, that there were all these Palestinian refugees produced by the formation of Israel. But Israel even denies that they're refugees, that a Palestinian living in Jordan, especially if not Lebanon and Syria, they kind of deny the existence, say, oh, they're just Arabs living in an Arab country, what's the problem, etc. And likewise now in Gaza, very much so, they want them to leave and kind of go into Egypt or Jordan or wherever, because their logic, again, is that, they would not be refugees, and even what that means is another kind of contested semantic, on one level, but all, deeply political question about that. Again, even indigeneity, Jews claiming indigeneity to Israel and what that means as a kind of political maneuver. So I think on one level, there's a kind of cynicism within which these semantic debates happen. But then on another level, there's a deep strategic investment in winning these sort of narrative battles. And I think in some ways, Israel, up until now, let's say, somehow has managed to win, in England and Europe and the US and the UN, win a lot of the kind of frameworks, and Palestine has been marginalized, been framed as a terrorist. That's another kind of semantic thing we can think about, who has the legitimate use of violence, the legitimate use of kind of death, the deaths committed that took place on October 7th versus, the 30,000 plus that have happened, what counts as terrorism versus what counts as self-defense, is another interesting conceptual, semantic, discursive framework. So I think in a lot of ways, the historical process of the last 100 years in the Middle East, or last, few hundred years in North America, has just been, the ability to frame conceptually what words get used, and, thinking about nation building in the US or Israel, and how that's happened, and what forms of legitimation it was able to use. So anyway, now with genocide or settler colonialism or indigeneity or refugeehood, that's what we were starting to think about in our project 10 years ago. In some ways, we were very green or new, and we didn't quite realize the scale or scope or stakes of what we were getting into. But I think the last 6 months have kind of raised the stakes quite a bit. And I think a lot of the screenings and discussions we've been doing have been really, there's our film itself, and, all the interviews we did, and the travels and collaborations with people on reservations or camps. But really, the film screenings are just an excuse to have these conversations, or kind of think through these things together in real time. But yeah, it's sort of fascinating. And again, the stakes couldn't be higher, not, for our film, but just to really think through and get a handle on how we relate to these terms, how we understand them, how and when and why they're applicable in these different contexts, et cetera. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think there is really an intense confluence between the conceptual and the narrative and the discursive, in this moment. And what strikes me as really important is that if we use the framework of apartheid or occupation, essentially we are pinpointing the problem at 1967, with the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. And yeah, but if we frame it as settler colonialism, we allow for the understanding of the crimes and the dispossession of Palestinians in 1948. And even beyond that, the 1936 Arab Revolt, Palestinians knew. It's really harrowing photos you see from like the 30s of Palestinians protesting, saying like, we are against the Zionist colonization of our land, that's supported by British imperialism. And so these connections definitely aren't new, but it's just like the sort of mainstream popular understandings of them and recognition of them.
It also, sorry, no, I mean, it also helps us make sense of what Israel's doing. I mean, because you have this idea of the occupation, but the occupation rests on an idea that Israel seeks to just merely occupy the West Bank and Gaza. But it's not only that. It's not only it helps us think before 1967. It's helping us now think after 2023, in terms of this renewed kind of. I mean, it's been going on for since Oslo and since before, but this kind of renewed westward expansion into the West Bank, the kind of destruction of Palestinian villages, and Israel's obvious, as Matt was saying, obvious desire to basically ethnically cleanse Gaza and push them into Egypt. So yeah, I mean, that's another reason why settler colonialism is helpful, because it helps us understand Israel as an expansionist entity, and also the ways in which it uses self-defense as a means to expand further, which is obviously quite similar to what happened with a lot of American settlers who would be attacked, let's say, would enter into conflict with Native people and then use their quote unquote self-defense as a method to further expand the borders of the United States.
No, precisely. And so even the term genocide, I mean, now it's just very vivid and explicit, and it's taken the most brutal and just horrific forms. But the term incremental genocide has been used for decades. I mean, I know for sure Ian Pape, the Israeli historian, uses it, especially in terms of Gaza, whereas that has been the policy for the last 20 years to make Gaza uninhabitable. Like aside from the bombings and the destruction, and now just the complete like razing of the entire strip, of all these cities. And so exactly, yeah, if we allow to understand, if we're able to understand the crimes of 48 and the dispossession of 48, we see it now. And again, Palestinians use this term, not just al-Nakba, right? But al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the
Mm,
continuous Nakba.
mm,
And indeed, I mean, 60% of the residents of the Gaza Strip are refugees from other parts of Palestine and
right.
now made double, triple, quadruple refugees. And so, and I find interesting when you discuss the solidarities because there's sort of like two dual conflicting solidarities that are going on. I mean, aside from the popular movements that are rising, and some of them are quite incredible, but there are solidarities between communities who are like victims of settler colonialism. But then there's also the solidarities of settler colonial nations. So like the US is just one, is the main backer of the state of Israel for many reasons, but then also Australia, you know? And
Mm,
so I think a part of it is this inability to recognize if we recognize that as settler colonialism and therefore settler colonialism as a thing that's bad, that creates victims that deserve reparations and return and whatever, then you acknowledge, the Native American, Indigenous Americans' demands for land back and for their own reparations. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about because I find these quite interesting, and obviously we've seen more of them these days and with social media and everything. But the solidarities and sometimes a bit more interesting, actually, the desire to not identify with the other, with not the
mm,
other, but with one another. Because I remember in conversation, I think in Sharjah, you had told me we were talking about when you had screened some of your films that you had filmed in a reservation in the US, in the Americas, and brought it back to a camp in Lebanon and showed it to them. They didn't want to identify, they didn't want to be in comparison with indigenous people because they had seen them as a defeated people. And so I remember then that sort of spurred a really interesting conversation. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think, first before that, I was just thinking, this dynamic of the occupation since 67 and, these internationally recognized borders that, that kind of framework gets talked about a lot. And I think a big part of the narration recently also is what are who gets to control the temporal logic of it, because there's also this dynamic where it's like, oh, the war started, Hamas started the war on October 7th, and that's the beginning of the historical frame that we can think about. Or like you're saying, oh, well, in 67, we worked all this out, and that's the kind of basis of discussion or agreement or whatever, these borders. But it's like, at what point, who gets to decide what's the historical point? And there's a corollary, I think, in the Americas, the colonization, because there's a whole series of treaties that get kind of written and then abrogated and broken and renegotiated, et cetera. And, we saw this at Standing Rock. There's a whole series of treaties around land rights and land usage and sovereignty around those lands and around those waters and rivers and hunting grounds. And a big part of it is, who gets to decide which treaty is the historic referent for the decision or something. And a big part of that, unfortunately, just comes down to like military force, despite whatever kind of sophisticated geopolitical international affairs we might want to imagine, we're currently operating in. Really, who gets to decide what the starting point of the discussion is, the historic starting point is just who has more, military weapons and planes and bombs, et cetera. And, that's undeniably Israel right now, a big part of it, which is because the United States, on the one hand, we're kind of debating some of these historic terms and some of these concepts on one level while the debate is really happening through bombs. You know what I mean? The debate is
mm,
really a military question or something. But then, part of it, when you try to respond militarily, you can't do that either, both because you don't have the same weaponry, but also because, the status, the kind of positionality makes you such that you're, the violent terrorist other. The same with Standing Rock or something, if they try to physically, block the pipeline rather than discursively, block the pipeline or something, there's criminal charges, there's, conspiracy charges, there's investigations, there's infiltration, et cetera, or something. So So there's that dynamic. But yeah, as you mentioned, when we first started the project and first started visiting people and shooting, discussing it, a lot of the Native Americans were kind of excited or curious about the juxtaposition because if we're honest, Palestine is one of the most mediatized colonial struggles in the world, for quite a long time. And again, it's not a large territory, and it's not a huge amount of people, really, if we're thinking about it, compared to other colonized peoples or something. But for better or worse, not that it's helped, but they have a huge amount of media attention and gaze. So I think Native Americans who do not and have been largely invisibilized, even within American society, never mind globally, we're kind of excited, or I don't want to, maybe excited is too strong a word, but we're open to thinking about the kind of parallels, the solidarities, the exchange, the discussion, etc. Whereas in Palestine and in Lebanon, there was a skepticism because they had themselves, seen American Indians as being defeated, erased, annihilated, totally assimilated, that it wasn't a living movement, a living struggle, etc. On the one hand, but then simultaneously there was a kind of conflicting um, contradiction, let's say, where on the one hand they were an annihilated people, but on the other hand they were just Americans, so they were fine. So, they had gained access to American citizenship, they had access to American infrastructure, economies, etc. So they were like, well, what's the problem? So there were these two things that in a way didn't make sense with each other. One, that they were annihilated, and then second, that they were just Americans now. So it wasn't really an issue. And only in the process of us showing some of our films and videos and talking about it did they really see that there were these things called reservations, of which there's more than 500, in the United States, which includes, many kind of native peoples and communities and tribes, tribal nations. And they were like, oh, we just didn't know, which is legitimate because lots of Americans don't know, never mind Palestinians living in camps. It's not that they should be expected to know. But I think there's also different, within settler colonialism, there's different frameworks of solidarity. I think the ideal one would be Algeria, where, the French were defeated and had to leave. That's the kind of pinnacle of kind of success of overcoming settler colonialism. Then maybe South Africa is the a second, where they come to some kind of agreement and some kind of reconciliation where they can decide to sort of figure out a new way to cohabitate that land or something. And that's been something spoken out spoken about more frequently in this kind of apartheid framework discussion, since the 80s and 90s, 2000s, et cetera. But by bringing it back to the United States, because the United States' specific role in, the Israel-Palestine question or something, and then bringing it back to American colonization, opens it up, but also opens up different temporalities to think of this process that, Israel's been a state for more than 75 years. The Zionist project is, more than a century old. So thinking about that temporality versus, the many centuries long colonial process in North America, there's also a fear of thinking about what's happened and how that's looked like, and then talking openly about that fear has been an interesting part of the project, and thinking about if there isn't a path to Palestinian statehood, either in the West Bank or Gaza or otherwise, what will that mean? And then, in the context of our project, these, what are called the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, do they become something like reservations? Are those, rather than a potential Palestinian state, are they then something like Palestinian reservations within Israel, within Israeli sovereignty or statehood, which is effectively what they are now? We could think about it as apartheid, or we could think of them as just an internally oppressed indigenous population or something that lives on reservations or Bantustans or whatever. You know what I mean? What does that mean or look like to kind of use, again, these different conceptual semantic framings for the conflict as a way to understanding it? And then if you look into kind of the histories in the United States, and I imagine similarly in Australia, New Zealand, there are kind of instances of a decade of just slow waiting out sickness and disease,
Mm.
and then there'll be a few years of intense, violent military conflict, and then it kind of alternates. It's not just one thing. It takes place over decades, if not centuries or something. So in a way, there are a lot of parallels, unfortunately, with the kind of process of colonization in the United States, where there are these flare-ups of militarized conflict or something. And then what's all the difference, I think, with Palestine is that there's a lot of international attention in the process of colonization in the United States. No one gave a shit. No one cared. There was no United Nations agency. There's no global media that's sort of monitoring it. That's kind of debating genocide, for example. There was no debate. No one cared. No one gave a shit. So on the one hand, there's an advantage, at least, because globally the media and people are paying attention, and other nations nominally have some kind of stake or investment in what's going on. But the kind of darker reality is really, is it just up to Israel itself and the United States? It's been unclear if the other nation states really have the kind of wherewithal or kind of backbone to intervene, aside from just discursively or writing some statement or something. And up until now, the answer is no. No one's really meaningfully intervened. So that's sort of the question, that's really the question of sovereignty itself on a global scale. Is we see these conflicts all over the world, Russia, Ukraine, the Kurdish populations in Turkey or Syria, Iraq, Iran. Is any foreign nation going to intervene in how a people colonizes its others, what I mean, within its borders or something? And up until now, the answer is really no, if we're honest. But yeah, I'm curious to leave it there.
Well, just very briefly, it is very, very interesting, heartwarming, and whatever that there is a case against Israel at the ICJ on charges of genocide, and not brought forth by any Arab nations, but by South Africa, right? And so I think that act in itself demonstrates the kind of understanding of the similar trajectories, the similar processes. I think there's a lot of differences, obviously, between South Africa and Palestine, namely that the Zionists are very happy to just wipe out the Palestinians completely. You know what I mean? Whereas that wasn't the case in South Africa. It was a minority ruling over whatever, and they needed the labor power. So it wasn't this like, let's get rid of them all. But nonetheless, I think, yeah, the settler colonial framework also helps to understand where those solidarities are coming from, but also that since this is something that is so aligned to Western imperialism and the global North and everything, so it's like you do see so many states and nations and peoples from the global South kind of rising and using whatever means they have, sorry, limited, but in terms of like international law. Um, and now I think Nicaragua is calling in Germany for complicity and um, aiding and abetting the genocide. And so that's quite interesting. But yeah, I wanted to talk a bit because I'm very interested, and I think people would be very interested to hear the ways in which your project kind of has manifested the sort of you described as a multimedia project over the course of 10 years. And so I don't know if Malik, you'd want to talk about some of the more like physical manifestations of it. You were arrested in one of the films. I remember. Am I remembering correctly?
No, that's correct. I was detained. I
Yeah,
was
go on.
detained. Yeah, okay, so I'll go into both my detainment and the multimedia aspect of the project. I'll begin with the last question first. I was detained when we were the first time we were in in Palestine. We were in a camp outside of Bethlehem called Dheisheh, and basically there are these series of ritualistic manifestations or demonstrations. Been in Paris too long. These demonstrations against that basically oftentimes they have different tenors. So there's the daily one that's kind of younger people, and then if there's some kind of an occasion, there'll be like there'll be one with like maybe youth, teenagers that's a bit more intense. But the drum beat is this daily protest, this daily demonstration by really young kids, not older than 12, 13 maybe, in front of the wall. And in Aida refugee camp, it's pretty surreal because it's right on the wall. And so you have this wall with a blue door. And on one side is a refugee camp, and on the other side are settlements. And like clockwork, at like 4 p.m., 3:30 p.m., and we would ask people, like, is there going to be a demonstration today? And they'd say, yeah, probably. I mean, is there going to be, are the Israeli army going to come into the camp today? They'd be like, yeah, probably around 3:30. That's how much it was like it was like a cuckoo clock, you know? So they would come out at 3:30 from their blue door. And I was there and I didn't have a press pass and I wasn't carrying a camera. So I think because was the oldest, they assumed that I was like the ringleader of the whole thing. And the demonstration was dispersed, and I ran inside. And basically, long story short, I noticed they were chasing behind me. They were giving, and I didn't want to continue running because they might shoot me, obviously. So I kind of went limp and allowed myself to be arrested. I didn't fight back at all, and I was dragged back basically into the wall. Like the wall, you can be inside the wall. And inside the wall were mainly military people. And when I got into the wall, I told them I was American. I actually had my passport in the back of my pants, the back pocket. And immediately their whole behavior changed on a dime. They became much more friendly and they were apologetic. And it was quite surreal to kind of go from being a Palestinian refugee who was being beaten, actually, and manhandled, to being an American citizen who was, worthy of respect and human dignity and all the rest of it. And yeah, that's basically, essentially what happened. And then once they realized I was American, they let me go off with a warning. And then I exited through the wall. And then I found myself back in something that looked like Lebanon, looked like a kind of poor, working class neighborhood in Beirut. So it was surreal that on one side, because I grew up a big part of my life in New York, in Westchester County, nice suburbs. And then I also lived in Beirut. So it was like both places in one geography, where you go from a kind of idyllic American style suburb into like, a popular quarter in Beirut. So that was quite interesting. So, and that was, we have footage of that in one of our segments. Oh, it was Aida camp, not Dahisha, Aida camp. One of our segments on Aida, and there's a movie called Walls of Bethlehem, which is kind of about the ritualistic nature of these demonstrations, which were not something we had planned for. They just simply happened when we were in Palestine, when we were in the camps surrounding Bethlehem. As far as the multimedia approach goes, I think Matt and I were very interested in just learning more about this, and really basically in kind of doing research, but also doing something wherein we try to analyze politics and the world we're in and the state we're in, because Matt and I, we were involved in activist work in New York. We were involved in Occupy Wall Street. I wasn't directly involved, but I was very touched by and following closely the Arab Spring. So there was this idea of, okay, after coming out of these political movements that were very defined by moments, that were very moment-based, there was a question, and it was where we were kind of taking a break, or we were in a moment of retreat somehow, and thinking, okay, what are permanent states of exception, not times of exception, like Occupy Wall Street or Arab Spring, but places of exception or spaces of exception, right? And the idea is, how do we enter into these spaces and try to speak to people there, both to learn more about those spaces and the people who live in them and their histories and everything, but also to understand the world we live in, the world we all live in collectively, from the point of view of intelligent, militant, organized people who are organizing and working within those spaces. And film was a way to do that. Film, and Matt and I have a background, of course, both of us in film. And so film was just one mechanism for us to enter into these spaces and kind of talk to people and see if we can, as Matt was saying, kind of have these conversations with people in reservations, with people in refugees, with people literally all over the world. So I think that was part of the impetus for the multimedia work. And another aspect, of course, was you accumulate so much footage in the course of filmmaking. It's really a shame to discard it all and put it in a feature film. So that was kind of the impetus for us having these short films. And also the short films allowed us to make work in reservations, show them in refugee camps, have conversations, make work in refugee camps, show them in reservations, have those conversations, and accumulate short films along the way that could circulate and could foster interesting discussions as we move towards the completion of the feature film. It also allowed us to experiment with different genres. Some of the short films are more experimental, others are more journalistic, some are more propagandistic. And it also allowed us to be able to respond to current events. So you can have this element that is away from current events, and that was intentional to have this, it be about space and not be in response to whatever's happening now. But because it's a multimedia project, there was a certain flexibility where we could respond to things going on. So for example, when Standing Rock happened, the movement at Standing Rock, we were able to travel twice. We made 2 short films, wrote 2 articles, but stuff from Standing Rock is not in the feature film, except the final shot of the film is from Standing Rock. And so, yeah, and then of course, in the film, yeah, so you could do different things. You have this, we have presentations, we have workshops, short films, and then sometimes also it's like a bit like a universe. And so sometimes it can be very general. So we could, for example, write something or just about indigeneity and refugeehood writ large. But then other times it can be super specific. Like, for example, I have it here. We along with our friend Philip and Kahan Tanento, we co-edited this book called The Mohawk Warrior. Well, it's not going to be on video, but this book called The Mohawk Warrior Society, which is a deep dive into the history of one particular group who we worked with and spoke to and shot in Akwesasne, which is one of the, so it's like a kind of a zoom in or a tight focus on the history of that particular group that we profiled in that reservation, which we didn't have obviously enough time to go into such depth in the feature film. So this multimedia aspect has allowed us to kind of work in different formats and at different levels, adopt a historical approach when necessary, and adopt a more contemporary organizational approach when necessary as well. Organizing approach, not organizational. Organizing oriented approach, yeah.
Yeah, because I remember when I first knew about the project before I'd watched the full film, I think before the film even came out, you have a website, and on the website there are a bunch of these short films, and so I watched them, and I think it is in one of these short films. I remember I was cooking and watching, and then I was like, "Oh my God, that's Malek! Oh my God, that's Matt!" And I think it's Matt yelling in the back of the thing, like he's American, he's a journalist, he's American, but they didn't give a shit, they're just taking it away. But also, yeah, some of these juxtapositions you talked about, sort of going macro to micro. Some of these juxtapositions are very interesting and telling. That, for instance, and as you learn more, again, I'm from Lebanon, and so I'm very far removed from the experience and the sort of history and the current context of indigenous peoples in the U.S. and in the Americas. But so I remember one of the films, or I think even in the main film, there was a lot about the chiefs or the sort of the heads, the more political members, kind of like the indigenous police, that reminded me so much of the PA, where it's like these guys are from us, but they are specifically created and given power such that they just manage us and they benefit in some material way. And so, yeah, that really reminds me of some of these things. And now we're seeing it again in discussions of Gaza and the quote unquote day after, wherein, I don't know, the Israelis are openly talking about, oh, we'll get the PA to come and administer it, like we have them administering the West Bank. And ultimately that stems from like Oslo and that whole disaster. So those juxtapositions I find interesting and illuminating, and also reify the sort of thesis of settler colonialism, which again, I think I got a random book delivered to me because I subscribed to something, and it was made like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, about like 500 years since Columbus arrived. And it really, again, I think some of these things feel so common knowledge now or so intuitive, but only 10, 20, 30 years ago, there really just was not that much of a popular understanding of each individual context of settler colonialism, let alone these connections. And I think, sorry to plug another documentary, I mean, it's like Al Jazeera, but I remember there was a documentary they had done a few years ago where I think they just sort of like indigenous swap. I don't know how to describe it, but like a indigenous people's community in Australia and in America kind of like swap places. And there they're like, holy shit, this is exactly the same.
Mm.
Um, that's much more direct comparison, but still, it was a big thing in the documentary that like, wow, this settler colonial project and processes, because again, these ideas weren't as popularized as they are now. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want to talk more about those juxtapositions and settler colonialism as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the one hand, the common denominator in a lot of these is just, England, England kind of, importing a lot of these structures and governmental and administrative bodies in different parts of the world, from the United States to Australia to Palestine, you know what I mean? And kind of thinking about, this kind of culture of efficiency and rational process or something, and thinking about what are the ways to kind of manage peoples and resources and lands and et cetera, is there's one kind of thread there that can be kind of looked at more deeply. But I think, yeah, when you're thinking about the PA, again, that's where I think these different temporalities comes in, because initially, there's this thing in the United States, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was initially under the Department of War, in the earlier part of the US, and then gets transferred to the Department of Interior, kind of managed as a kind of almost land question or something. And initially it's kind of European descended peoples, and then it kind of slowly becomes populated by Native Americans who are kind of participating in the US project and kind of taking it over, which kind of gives it a different look, because it's Native Americans running this agency, but for the benefit of the United States, that could be debated or something. So you have this kind of colonial experience, and then each individual tribal nation and each reservation has its own administration. And at first, it's sort of managed by U.S. military, and then gradually it's kind of handed over to sympathetic Native Americans that can kind of liaise and interface. But on the one, that's this kind of dynamic of struggle where on the one hand, you could think like, okay, they're trying to advocate for their peoples and act as middle managers or something, or are they just sort of conciliatory, sellout kind of people that abandon liberation, abandon this separation? But those debates have been happening for 150 years, if not longer, in the United States, within it's just since Oslo, really, right? In the Palestinian context. But I think have been already perceiving this similar dynamic of how the PA functions within the West Bank. And, part of this debate, since October 7th about Hamas and the PA is, there's, people don't like the PA. They want the fall of the PA. They want the dissolution of the PA. But, the Hamas alternative is also horrific in a kind of different kind of way. And I think in both contexts, you have the undermining of a different kind of indigenous leadership or different indigenous organizational forms, because precisely they posed a threat to the colonial project and the colonial process. So it wasn't just the aerial bombardment or the denial of food services or the razing of cities and towns and villages like you're talking about. It's also this organizational undermining of certain leaders, certain leadership, etc., to prevent, in some ways, legitimate, quote unquote, leaders from emerging that could actually manage a separate Palestinian or native or whatever kind of existence on that land. So you kind of get stuck. And I think that's part of the fear, not just the annihilation happening in Gaza, but the lack of a kind of coherent, legitimate organizational form. Never mind, the massing imprisonment and incarceration of Palestinians within the occupied territories, or the diaspora, the fact that so many people were forced to leave, forced to kind of flee, live outside of the region, aren't allowed to come back, etc. So all of these, really amounts to the same thing, where it just becomes a management question of how do we deal with this unruly population within these lands. We want these lands without these people. So on the one hand, the West Bank, they're kind of settling, and breaking apart the lands, not giving land permits, not giving sovereignty. In the Gaza, it's just been under siege and blockade for close to 20 years, So it's like two different strategies. Both have different flaws, pros and cons in terms of sovereignty or something. I'm speaking before October 7th, and now, recently you just have this new phase of kind of, unprecedented violence or something that it's still unclear what's going to happen in the ways in which some of the Arab and Gulf nations are kind of negotiating. It's sort of unclear what their vision is itself, to be honest. Maybe you guys can speak better to that or something, but when they're negotiating, what are they negotiating for actually, and what's their kind of interest or motivation or something? And then who are the kind of Palestinian, whatever, that's maybe a separate question or something. But yeah, I think thinking about the PA and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is a fascinating comparison as well, and thinking about how they both emerge, why they both emerge, what their function is, whether they represent self-determination and liberation, or whether they represent just quieting down, the populations or something, is another kind of fascinating thing that, I think actually Malek and I didn't explore that much in the context of the project, because it was so micro, because we were looking at the reservations in a very specific way. We didn't think about not that we didn't think, but in the context of the project, we didn't really showcase or highlight the kind of overarching national agencies or entities that were managing, these kind of groups or something. But, now we've been trying to work on more writing projects, a book project, and I think that's something certainly that we would kind of explore more in that context. Yeah.
I want to just add to Matt's historical analysis. I mean, some of what Matt was saying about Israel's undermining of a kind of independent Palestinian leadership, and then the PA. Just as a historical note, I think it's important for those of your listeners who don't know. I mean, the PA, the construction of the PA was rooted to the Intifada, in a sense that it's precisely because Israel, not only did Israel fear parties outside of the kind of PA Hamas framework, but there was a fear of really grassroots democratic leadership. And as the Intifada kind of took off in the late 80s, and it started in refugee camps, I think in a refugee camp in Gaza, I have to double check, but it began in the Palestinian refugee camps in the occupied territories, and a kind of new generation, and it mobilized Palestinian society outside of the PLO, outside of the organizational networks of the PLO, and Israel feared a kind of democratically grassrooted civilian Palestinian leadership. And that's precisely why they did at that point, which was the unthinkable, which is recognize the PLO as the legitimate spokesperson of Palestine, and kind of give them this state without sovereignty. So rather than a people with sovereignty and no state, they went to having a state with no sovereignty, and turned the PLO into a kind of subcontractor for the occupation, and as basically the worst aspects of statehood or quasi-statehood, without any of the benefits of sovereignty and dignity, etc. And that was a direct way of countering the potential democratic political forces that could have been, and then indeed were being unleashed by the first Intifada in the 80s. So that's how the PLO came into being. I mean, not the PLO, how the PA, the Palestinian Authority, came into being. And so, yeah, that's linked to this question of, not only, Matt's very right, it's not only a question of fragmenting territory, it's also a question of destroying any kind of unified democratic Palestinian leadership. And that's part of what makes it genuinely so difficult to imagine a future, is because, I mean, it's true, there isn't a good Palestinian leadership, but we have to understand why that is. And how that's a big part of Israel, has been a big part of Israel's strategy.
Yeah, again, for me, history is very important here, and that's like in framing things as settler colonialism. So then understanding the Zionist project as a settler colonial movement that started in the late 19th century. And one of the key moments of defeat of the Palestinian resistance to that colonialism and to British imperialism was 1936-39, the Great Revolt. Because in that period, the leadership that existed was expelled, was killed, was fragmented, was pushed into Jordan and Lebanon and whatever.
By
And
the
so
British.
then by the British and
Right.
with assistance with the sort of like early like Jewish paramilitary thugs, some of them just literally terrorist organizations. But exactly. And so then when 48 comes around, there just is no political leadership. There is no military leadership. There's no one who actually has an understanding of the situation on the ground. And then all this bullshit of the Arab armies and whatever, it's none of it is true. But but yes, and bringing up the first Intifada is very important because it's not only the time that then like Oslo Accord comes afterwards, but it's when Hamas comes into being because
Mm.
it started in a neighborhood in Gaza, and there was this sort of need for new whatever. Anyway, and this desire for things that are like beyond whatever and organizing in a way and armed resistance and Midrishu. Um, but yeah, I remember once sitting in a cafe in Beirut and overhearing this like really obnoxious American person talking and saying something like, where's and I've heard this 1,000 times ago since, it's like, where is the Palestinian national Nelson Mandela?
He's
And I
in jail.
find that he's in jail. He's in
In
jail, but
jail.
also he's dead. He's buried. He's been
Right.
killed for like whatever. And then
Right.
also, who is this Nelson Mandela, this like whitewashed Nelson Mandela in your mind? Because for
Right.
30 years he was in jail and he was
Right.
counted as considered a terrorist.
Right. Right.
And also like so it's frustrating, it's bullshit. And I mean, I'm not even going to get into the thing, but there's this whole thing that for me, settler colonialism cuts through so many of the myths and
Mm.
so much of the propaganda and so much of this, um, there's a great book by Ian Pape, 10 Myths of Israel, which again feels of a time, 2015. And honestly, I can't really plug myself into thinking how I was thinking or how people were thinking 10 years ago. But so I'll pose that question to you, since you've been doing this project for 10 years, and since so much of the project has been talking to these communities and within these communities, but also to broader audiences, how have you seen those discussions shift and change? I'll bring up one tiny example as well, because Matt, you'd brought up the kind of Gulf considerations in all of this. Your world premiere was in Sharjah in 2019, but this is well before the Abraham Accords. This is
Mm.
before the UAE's like normalization campaign. And I don't know if that film would be allowed to be screened today in the UAE. Um, and so things have shifted at a kind of macro scale, but then they've also shifted at the grassroots, at the kind of just like what is discussable, where the conversation is going. It's no longer these discussions can no longer be shut down by just being called anti-Semitic. Like that used to be a thing. But now it's just no, it's untenable and it's beyond. So how have you seen these discussions, especially re-settler colonialism as a framework to understand Zionism, changed over the course of these 10 years that you've been working on this project?
I think if you're in Germany, they could still shut it down, but maybe not elsewhere. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the Abraham Accords, I mean, it's interesting. I don't normally like to think of it in these terms, but I think, during the Trump administration with Jared Kushner, there was a huge push to kind of normalize Israel with as many Arab and Gulf countries as possible, which was largely successful, if we're being honest. They made a huge stride, and it seemed as if, Saudi was the next piece to fall. And in many ways, it seemed as if, the Hamas attacks was somehow meant to undermine that being possible. And on that level, at least, if we could think of it like that in some way, it worked. Um, but I think, the reason I mention that is, we're in this election year in the United States, and, it seemed as if Trump was this horrific kind of figure for many reasons, but specifically for the Israel-Palestine question, moving the capital to Jerusalem, acknowledging the Golan Heights, etc. But seeing Biden and the Democratic Party oversee this genocide, if we accept to call it that, has been a bit major shock, and I think is fracturing in some aspects of the Democratic Party and how people relate to that, is specifically generationally. I think a lot of millennials or Generation Z are much less sympathetic to Israel as before. And I think that that generational shift is quite potent. And then in the United States, at least, it's been the largest mobilization of Jewish anti-Zionists, maybe since the formation of Israel. At least in my lifetime, I never remember or imagined such a large mobilization of Jews against the occupation, against the genocide, against violence, Jews for Palestine, etc. So I think that's a major shift, but it's like now in this election year, it's unclear, who is worse. We see what Trump did, we see what Biden's doing. It's unclear what the difference, what actually, someone might want, and then geopolitically, how people are angling for this. Jared Kushner recently made some comments in the Middle East talking about, Gaza could be really nice beachfront property and it could be really valuable, et cetera. Thinking about the Zionist project back for 100 years, it's interesting also to think that people were quite clear. It wasn't like some hidden secrecy. There's all kinds of documents and correspondence, journals, magazines, writings where they spelled out exactly what their plan was for Palestine far before 48, and really just incrementally, as we are saying, kind of achieved it little by little through different mechanisms, different ways, different allies, partnerships. Knowing when to shift away from the UK towards the United States was a kind of another pivotal shift.
Mm.
Now it's kind of this different question of who would be the allies for this current kind of Zionist imaginary of their own next 10, 20, 30 years or something. But yeah, I think in terms of our project, in terms of the shifts that we've noticed, there was a movement in 2013 called Idle No More, largely taking place in Canada, which was a kind of an indigenous movement, as the name says, kind of waking up and kind of protesting more environmental issues, a lot of violence against women issues. And it did seep into the United States a bit. And that was right around the time we were starting our project. There was opposition during the Obama administration to the Keystone Pipeline, or, this kind of notion of building a different pipeline really through the same areas of the Lakota and Dakota territory or something. But it was much less known. And in the process of the project with the Standing Rock movement in 2016, these questions around settler colonialism, indigenous rights, even the term of like BIPOC, so to speak, kind of emphasizing Black and indigenous specifically in the US context, was something that emerged over the 10 years of our project, I think. And then, in the Palestine case, there's almost, unfortunately, almost annual waves of some kind of horrific bombing campaign, massacre, etc. But, Malik's been outside of New York for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years at this point or something. But we happened to be together when October 7th, we were heading in New York or something. And at first it was kind of shocking, but it was still unclear what it meant and what it was going to mean. But yeah, it seems maybe the biggest event, in this moment in our lifetimes or something, and still thinking about unpacking it. One
Mm.
thing I've been thinking about though since October, or since maybe November, let's say, is the moment at which it ceases to be on the news or on the front page of the New York
Mm.
Times or the CNN or whatever, and what that means and looks like. It's obviously going to take decades to rebuild whatever was existed in Gaza, and then what would that, just physically, never mind socially, mentally, psychically, organizationally, etc., to just reconstruct what was already a horrific blockade or something. But are people going to be paying attention, consistently through that time? That's what I'm sort of worried about. Now, we can think about the 6-month anniversary since October, but I've noticed the last, say, month or so, there's already been a bit less kind of visibility, there's kind of an exhaustion, a fatigue, and overwhelmness, which is, all understandable in some ways in terms of international solidarity. But what's going to happen when people stop paying attention, which you can see a bit in Ukraine now? People are not thinking or talking as much about what's going on there. What does that mean for Gaza, et cetera, or any kind of these international conflicts, so to speak, to use that language. What happens when the West stops paying attention or stops kind of caring or stops rallying or whatever. Then that's also part of the colonial process where there's a kind of initial moment of outrage, and then the colonial project has a different temporality where it can kind of continue its thing for years and not weeks. You know what I mean? It has a strategic
Mm,
vision.
mm,
And I think when we're talking about the Zionist project, for what we're saying, for 100 years, it has had a strategic vision for the entirety of that land. And in some ways, this fits within that. You know what I mean? But it's like to kind of do international solidarity. It's just hard for individuals to kind of have that same kind of duration. You know what I mean? And it's like it's the difference between an ideological structure and an individual. Like the ideological structure and the institutional structures, the individuals can change, but it's still the same project. It's not Sharon anymore who had the same vision. It's a different set of characters or something, right? So it's like, and even now there's this move to kind of, it seems to maybe pin the blame on Netanyahu. It's like, oh,
mm.
let's just get rid of Netanyahu and then it'll be fine and we'll just kind of renegotiate, et cetera. But it's like in some way he doesn't matter, you know what I mean? Or Biden doesn't matter. These individual characters are secondary to the kind of structure, as you're saying, of settler colonialism, exactly, of that kind of technique of colonial kind of land domination. And then, but us as individuals, how do we kind of match that structural dynamic or something? And I think that kind of gets back to these questions of leadership, organizational forms, et cetera, that are, if you can just wipe out individuals or wipe out 30,000 people or something, there's different scales of activity that we're thinking about or we're talking about or something. So now I think if just Netanyahu does step down or gets voted out or whatever, as if that's some kind of healing moment or something, when clearly it's not, because this, even if it wasn't clear what this was this last 6 months, it was sort of in the imaginary of the Zionist project for decades.
Yeah, I agree. I really hate this pinpointing onto Netanyahu as though he's not surrounded by fanatics, but also the structure of the entire entity, the entire state from the very beginning. And again, this is why settler colonialism is a valuable thing, because understanding the foundation of the state itself, like what is the state built on? It's not as though there was a state and then they did this bad thing 20 years later in 1967
Right.
and they've never been able to whatever. Like, no, the state itself is founded on the dispossession of Palestinians. Like every Israeli town or city is the ruins of a Palestinian village, is the site of a massacre. And so when looking at that history, you do see terrifying parallels with what they're doing in Gaza. It is the same tactic sometimes, except now with like horrifically superior and like advanced technology. Yeah, I agree. The juxtaposition as well in this terms with the US and with these leaders, these like unremarkable people. There's not a character that like, oh, this is Joe Biden doing his thing. It's just this is the United States military and imperial interests or whatever.
Mm.
But almost, and I've seen this description like against any like political expediency. Like this is an election year. He's going to lose. Like he's going to lose because he has dug himself into, okay, I'm gonna put this out there just because I've been thinking and saying this a lot. But the minute that Donald Trump, again, fuck him, hate him, fascist, piece of shit. There's no saying he's better or whatever. But the minute that he tells Joe Biden in one of these debates, you know what they're calling you, Joe? Genocide Joe. You know that? You know that's what they're calling you. They wouldn't say that to me. The minute he says that, it's over. I predict this. This is me forecasting this or foreshadowing this, but genuinely, like Joe Biden has really dug himself into a genocide trench, and he's just but again, it's beyond him because it's taken 6 months, and only now people are like shuffling their feet, like the Nancy Pelosi's and the whatever, and the entire leadership, aside from like the Republicans, who are the most dangerous people on the entire planet. But yeah, and then in Lebanon and sorry, in the Arab world and everything, it's really fucked. Sorry, I lost myself there. Oh yeah, so I really don't like these descriptions when it's like it's just a Netanyahu thing, and this is why these protests in 48 Palestine, like in Israel, mean absolutely nothing to me. And oh, sorry, this is the parallel because I think in the United States, something that a lot of people have described is that sort of like 2020 moment when Trump was voted out and there was this movement and there was Black Lives Matter and there was all these things, and then once Biden was elected so many people dropped out. So many people were like, "Oh, we've done our bit. Now we can go back to brunch." Like this is the thing I've heard 1,000 times, especially from like people talking about white people and liberals and whatever. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Matt. I am nervous about what happens when it stops being. And they are trying to censor. I mean, Meta is censoring and Twitter is censoring, and now they want to ban TikTok in the United States. And obviously, a big part of that is, because the kids are all right. The kids are just kind of seeing stuff and saying stuff that no one's ever said before, not because of the algorithm, but because they can cut through the bullshit much easier. They're seeing it directly. They're not raised with this New York Times narrative that then they have to sort of be confronted with sort of certain facts or certain images. So they're
Mm.
not like propagandized from the beginning, which, I had to do. For example, even in Lebanon, I went to like a private school. So like I did grow up with some Zionist myths that then I had to sort of deconstruct and be like, oh, that was a lie, which is much harder than if you never heard those to begin with and just start off and seeing like, wait, what? What have they been doing for the last 60 years? What is this project? Anyway, so I think we should start wrapping up slowly, but do you have any sort of like last reflections? I will say from now, I should have mentioned before, I'm very sorry, but usually how we end these episodes is I ask you to give a book recommendation, film recommendation. What are you reading? What would you have people read or whatever? But before that, so you can sort of think about that before, if you have any last reflections, anything that you want to say or plug, if you have a screening coming up, the floor is yours.
Well, Matt's the one who's doing a lot of the screenings are happening in America. So Matt knows better than me, but I think there's a screening in Troy in upstate New York where one of the people who was in our film, a guy named Roger, who's an Aquasasne, is going to be there. So that's great. It's always good when someone from the film is able to be there. When we were just in Malmo, a friend from Burj al Barajni happened to be in Malmo. He's a refugee from Lebanon, well, from Palestine, who lived in Lebanon, now is a refugee in Sweden. And he happened to be there, which was super cool. Um, but yeah, I mean, in terms of what's going on, there's going to be more screenings in New York and hopefully more screenings, all over the world. We're working on things here in Europe. Nothing is set in stone yet, but there might be a screening in Paris in June. And in terms of wrapping up, no, I don't have a big grand statement that I would want to make other than going. I'm glad, first of all, that we've able to really center a discussion of settler colonialism on this episode because we don't. I think in other times we've had discussions about different things, and settler colonialism has come up, but here it's really been the framework of the discussion. I think that's been actually quite useful for me and Matt. So thanks a lot, Eamon. It's been good to like think through that in such a comprehensive way, a relatively comprehensive way. Um, what I wanted to say, what's interesting about settler colonialism, and you guys know Netanyahu, is that because it allows for critique within it, because it's this big process where you can always blame something on a particular person. You could say Netanyahu is this, or this party is that, or this American general in the 19th century is particularly brutal. So it kind of allows for criticism while the bigger machine can still grind on, and that's one of its powers. And another thing about settler colonialism is also what I was just thinking about is the way that it uses nationalism or nationhood of its enemies, and it can kind of give and deny it depending on what it needs to do. So at a certain point, it became useful in the first Intifada for Israel to kind of not, of course, give the Palestinians a country. I'm not saying that, but to kind of nominally recognize a kind of possibility of Palestinian statehood or to conceptualize Palestinians as a state because it distracted from the apartheid of the actual what was going on. Because effectively, de facto, at the time of the first Intifada, Palestinians were basically living in one state, just in apartheid, a deeply apartheid state. So it became more useful for Israel to kind of think of the Palestinians as a nation or as a state separate from them in order to reframe the conflict. But now we're exiting that phase where even Israel is saying, because before Israel would cling to this two-state solution or the idea of a two-state solution like a lifeboat as a way of normalizing the occupation and normalizing. But now we're in a new phase where they're actually disinterested in the two-state and they're openly rejecting it. So now we've moved from a time where it was useful to think of Palestinians as a country within the settler colonial project. Now it's no longer that, and so now there's going to be a struggle of, okay, what kind of language is the Zionist project going to use to describe Palestinians if they're explicitly rejecting giving them letting them have a state, right? So that's also going to be something interesting to watch. Is like, what kind of, is it just that they're non-humans? I mean, we're going back into like a Nazi kind of, like a completely just kind of World War II kind of like, not, borderline, yeah, basically kind of Nazi-ish kind of mentality where they are subhumans. I mean, what kind of rhetoric can be used to describe the status of these human beings who are explicitly not going to have a country and are explicitly not going to be citizens of Israel, right? So that's something interesting to think of within the. And there's also been a similar play within America, where it's been at certain times America has considered individual tribes to be nations, at other times not. And at times America moved from destruction towards assimilation. So there became different movements, right? At different points in time, America granted, even when America, for example, granted Native people American citizenship, it was to kind of dissolve the indigenous nations. And America has also gone back and forth between giving nominal kind of nationhoodish status to tribes and then taking it away at times when it was convenient. So settler colonialism can kind of mobilize different conceptions at times where it works. That's just a small point I wanted to add. It's by no means a summary. And then you had asked about books.
I just wanted to wrap up, see if Matt has anything or final thoughts.
No, I was thinking of going into the books also. I don't have any general final thoughts aside from that. Yeah.
So just on my end, because based off of what you were saying, Malik, I agree. And I think the inability for the Zionists and especially the leadership to the language, the collapse of that language is part and parcel, I think, of the collapse of a certain phase of the settler colonial project. And yeah, now you just see this mess of ideological straw, like the way Netanyahu calls just Palestinians, like, or the way they call Hamas, Nazi ISIS.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. It's not actually a coherent construct, but it's this thing that you can identify. It's an ideological thing. You know that if they're ISIS, you can just kill them all. And that's how they're talking about Palestinians as a whole. And so if they're all just terrorists in, 20 years of war on terror, where a terrorist is someone who by choice has rescinded their, you know what I mean, right to life
Mhm.
and completely dehumanizes them and depoliticizes and whatever. And so it is this return to form of unpeople. And in the context of the war on terror, this is the language they've been using. But instead of a group or an ideology or a movement, it's an entire population. And yeah, that's really scary. But there are cracks, and this is the sort of silver lining, even though things are more brutal than they've ever been. Many people point to this brutality as a sign of the collapse of, as it's collapsing, it becomes much more violent. But it's terrifying because it's the kind of thing of, are they going to bring us all down with it?
Right. It's also, I think it's collapse. Sorry, you got me thinking. I think the collapse of the Zionist project is conditioned on what kind of world is existing outside of it. Right. I mean, I think the collapse of the Zionist entity only makes sense, or the collapse of the Zionist project, the settler colonial project, only makes sense in a context where there's certain norms or the world is moving in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Because if we're living in a world where fascism is rampant everywhere, then it just becomes one more cog in a machine that's moving the world in a whole nother direction. So I think so. Yeah. So whether or not this is the death throes of this project, or whether or not it is just merely a transition to a new and more awful phase, is dependent on what kind of world we're moving
Yeah.
into in general, right? As a globe.
All right. On that light, upbeat note, you can give your recommendations if you'd like, whoever would want to start.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, it's interesting ending on that dark note because, I was thinking we didn't really touch on Lebanon at all, which is actually, for you two guys and thinking about the surrounding context and climate and specifically when you said him and bringing us all down with them, what that means. And, I guess, we won't get into it now, but it is fascinating the ways in which Israel has tried to expand the conflict, to Syria, to Lebanon, with Iran, etc., as a way of also deflecting or making it seem like it's under some kind of existential threat when clearly it's not. But in terms of books, I think these aren't quite, deep cuts or something, but the two books in terms of the juxtaposition that I think mirror each other, that I just was reading or rereading the last 6 months. One is, Rashid Khalidi's The 100-Year War on Palestine, and I think settler colonialism is in the subtitle of the book. And then the American counterpart to that is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, where she kind of does really the same thing. She traces from the beginning of European arrival into the U.S. and thinking about the different, the precise. It's short. It's maybe 250 pages, but it's a good historical overview of American colonization. I think those would be the two primer recommendations related to our project. Just thinking about that. And then, Patrick Wolf has this text, this kind of grounding text on settler colonialism. I think it's called it's in the Journal of Genocide Studies, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, where he touches on both Palestine and colonization in the Americas. So yeah, those would be the reading recommendations. And of course, our website's thenativeandtherefugee.com. We have all of our own, writings and our book and our short videos. And if people want to organize screenings of the film, please get in touch. We have an Instagram and a Facebook page. We're happy to have the film screen wherever, either with us in present or, we can zoom in or people can screen it on their own. And in terms of the multimedia practice, a big part of that has been the screenings. It's not just that showing the film, but these discussions like we've had, on the podcast kind of open up the film and the project and the research more than just the film itself. So, we're grateful for these opportunities. So yeah, thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I would add in terms of the canonical works that Matt was mentioning, I'd also add Neither Settler Nor Native by Mahmoud Mamdani, which is a book that takes case studies from around the world, including apartheid South Africa, United States, Palestine, the Holocaust as well. Another book I'd recommend is No Spiritual Surrender, Indigenous Anarchy in Defense of the Sacred. And the reason I bring up that book is because it was written by Clee Benally, who is an activist and a musician from the Navajo Nation, who is a central figure. I don't like to use the word character. Let's say central figure in the Navajo Nation segment of the film. And he has a lot of incredible insights and comments in that section. And that's a book that he wrote. And he recently, unfortunately, passed away, as have a lot of the people in the film, unfortunately. He passed away, I want to say, a month or two ago. And so I would recommend his book as a book that you probably wouldn't have heard of otherwise, I would assume. And also anything by, any of the kind of writings of Walid Daqqa, who, as you know, passed away, I think it was today, in Israeli jail, the Palestinian intellectual. I don't know how much of his works are translated into English, but he's has some interesting writings on the right of return, where he speaks about the right of return as an anti-nostalgic project, right? That shouldn't be this kind of folkloric turning back of the clock to 1947, but kind of ways of creatively thinking of the right of return as a future-oriented project, as opposed to a kind of nostalgic project. So his writings are kind of interesting. Yeah, that's it. And then to plug, if I'm going to plug, I would plug our book, The Mohawk Warrior Society, which is not really our writings. It's interviews with people from Akwesasne. And it also really features the work of Louis Hall, who's a key thinker in terms of indigenous sovereignty, Mohawk sovereignty, who actually doesn't just assert sovereignty, but tries to kind of map out what a particularly Iroquois or Haudenosaunee sovereignty could look like. But it's a universalist project. It's not only for the Haudenosaunee people, but it's rooted in Haudenosaunee conceptions of nature and land and place and people and society, etc. So it goes beyond merely claiming sovereignty, but trying to reimagine sovereignty outside of a Western framework, which is quite interesting. And so we republished a lot of his key texts in that book.
Those were all really great recommendations. Thank you for sharing those. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. This was a lovely conversation, and
absolutely,
yeah, good luck with all future screenings and with everything else. And yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ayman. It was really good.
Thanks, Ayman.